For over a century, trains have been symbols of progress and connection, carrying millions across cities, mountains and plains. But in the blink of an eye, this trusted mode of transportation can turn into a stage for unimaginable tragedy. What if the journey you trusted the most became your last? In this video, we delve into the stories behind the world's deadliest train disasters, moments of chaos and destruction that left entire nations mourning. From fiery explosions that lit up the night sky to tsunamis swallowing trains whole, each event is a harrowing reminder of the fragility of human life in the face of disaster. The Ufa Train Disaster, 1989. On a warm summer night in 1989, two trains sliced through the dense forests of the Ural Mountains. Neither train nor its passengers knew they were about to become part of one of the most devastating rail disasters in human history. These were not just any trains. Train 211 from Novosibirsk and Train 212 from Adler were packed with families, children, and vacationers, ordinary people seeking a moment of joy during the twilight of the Soviet era. Beneath their routes, a silent killer was waiting. A critically damaged natural gas pipeline, its metal skin riddled with corrosion and faulty welds. For hours, the pipeline had been leaking, creating an invisible, deadly cloud that stretched across several kilometers of forest. Natural gas, colorless, odorless, gathered in a low-lying area near the train tracks, waiting for a single spark. Just after midnight, fate intervened. As the two trains passed each other near the village of Asha, something triggered an ignition, perhaps a train's electrical system, or the friction of metal wheels against track. In an instant, the gas cloud transformed into a weapon of unimaginable destruction. The explosion was apocalyptic. Seismographs registered the blast as an earthquake. A fireball hundreds of meters high erupted, consuming everything in its path. The shock wave shattered windows in nearby villages and threw train carriages like children's toys. Some hurled deep into the surrounding forest. Survivors would later describe a vision of hell. Carriages turned to twisted metal. Passengers burned beyond recognition, the forest itself catching fire. The heat was so intense that many died instantly, their final moments a brief, terrifying inferno. Others ran from the wreckage, their bodies horrifically burned, desperately seeking escape. When rescue teams arrived, they found a landscape of total devastation. Emergency workers and military personnel battled the flames and tried to rescue survivors, but the scale of the tragedy was overwhelming. In the days that followed, the death toll continued to climb, ultimately reaching more than 575 lives lost, with 800 others severely injured. This was more than just an accident. It was a stark testament to the systemic failures of the Soviet infrastructure, a pipeline poorly maintained, safety standards ignored, human lives reduced to statistics. The Ufa train disaster would become a chilling symbol of an empire's neglect, a single night that exposed the deep fractures in a crumbling system. Decades later, the story remains a haunting reminder of how a moment's negligence can transform an ordinary summer night into an unimaginable tragedy. The Sri Lanka tsunami train disaster. On December 26, 2004, the Earth itself became a weapon of unimaginable destruction. In a single, terrifying moment, a massive earthquake, one of the most powerful ever recorded, would unleash a nightmare that would reshape continents and claim hundreds of thousands of lives. The Indian Ocean floor trembled with a force that would alter the planet forever. The seismic shock unleashed a tsunami of unparalleled power, sending towering waves racing across the ocean to devastate communities in over a dozen countries. Amid this widespread destruction, one event stands out as particularly harrowing. The train at the heart of this tragedy was the Samudra Devi, or Queen of the Sea, a popular passenger service that connected Sri Lanka's bustling capital, Colombo, with the coastal city of Matara. That morning, the Samudra Devi departed Colombo at 6:50 a.m., filled with holiday travelers, daily commuters, and families eager to visit loved ones during the festive season. As the train rolled south along Sri Lanka's scenic coastal railway, the passengers were unaware of the impending calamity that would turn their journey into a nightmare. By 9:30 a.m., the tsunami had already devastated Sri Lanka's eastern shores. When the first wave reached the southern coastal village of Paralia, where the Samudra Devi was traveling, it carried the roar of destruction. Witnesses described hearing a deafening sound as the ocean surged inland, submerging everything in its path. path. The train came to a halt near Paralia as water began to flood the tracks and rise ominously around it. Many passengers, believing the steel train to be their best protection against the chaos outside, chose to remain on board. A few sought refuge on higher ground, sensing the danger yet to come. Moments later, the second wave arrived, far more powerful and towering nearly 30 feet high. It struck with relentless force. The wave swallowed the train, lifting its carriages off the tracks like toys. The Samudra Devi was slammed into pieces, its compartments crushed and overturned by the water's ferocity. Passengers inside were trapped, many unable to escape the rising floodwaters or the crushing weight of the wreckage. The wave carried the shattered train and its passengers far inland, leaving behind only destruction and despair. In the aftermath, chaos reigned. Rescue efforts were painfully slow as the tsunami had ravaged roads and infrastructure, making access to the site nearly impossible. Survivors and local villagers worked frantically to free those trapped in the twisted remains of the train, but with limited tools and resources, their efforts were often in vain. The devastation was overwhelming. Bodies lay scattered across the wreckage, and the scale of loss was almost incomprehensible. Entire families were wiped out, railway staff perished alongside their passengers, and even children who had been joyfully looking forward to the holidays were lost in the waves. The disaster became a chilling symbol of the tsunami's indiscriminate power, showing no mercy to man, machine, or landscape. As authorities and aid organizations grappled with the overwhelming logistics of recovery, the heartbreak deepened. Identifying victims, providing medical care for survivors, and rebuilding shattered lives proved a monumental challenge. Today, a memorial stands at Paralia, serving as a solemn reminder of the tragedy and the lives lost. The Samudra Devi disaster remains etched in history, a haunting testament to the sheer force of nature and the fragility of human life in its path. The Bihar Train Derailment, 1981. The Bihar train derailment of June 6, 1981, stands as one of the deadliest train accidents in history, claiming an estimated 750 to 800 lives. This catastrophic event occurred near the Bagmati River in the Indian state of Bihar during monsoon season. The train, a passenger service carrying several hundred people, was traveling from Mansi to Sahasa, a route that cut through the rural plains of northern Bihar. Many of the travelers were families and daily commuters heading to their destinations despite heavy monsoon rains lashing the region. As the train approached a bridge over the Bagmati River near the village of Balagat, it encountered severe weather conditions. The rains had swollen the river, making the water levels dangerously high, and strong winds buffeted the train. The tracks, already old and poorly maintained, were slippery and possibly unstable due to the deluge. While the exact cause remains disputed, many accounts suggest that the driver may have been attempting to reduce speed as the train crossed the bridge. Tragically, as the train was midway across the bridge, it derailed. Several carriages plunged into the fast-flowing Bagmati River below, where the powerful current quickly swept them away. The submerged carriages filled with water, trapping passengers inside. Many others were thrown into the river, where they struggled against the torrents. Survivors described scenes of chaos and panic, with people screaming and clinging to debris in a desperate attempt to stay afloat. The aftermath revealed the extent of the disaster. Rescue operations were severely hampered by the remoteness of the location and the adverse weather. Official rescue teams arrived hours later, and even then, they struggled with limited resources and the strong currents of the flooded river. Bodies of victims were recovered from the river over several days, with many floating downstream. Identifying the deceased proved difficult, as many had no identification and entire families had perished. The exact death toll remains uncertain, with estimates ranging between 750 and 800. Several hundred more were injured, some critically, and dozens were reported missing. Till today, the Bihar train derailment remains a dark chapter in India's history. For the families of the victims, the memories of that fateful day only serve to bring back the pain of their loss. The Guadalajara Train Disaster, 1915. On a crisp January morning in 1915, a train unlike any other prepared to journey through the war-torn landscape of western Mexico. This was no ordinary transport, it was a lifeline during the Mexican Revolution, carrying nearly 900 passengers, soldiers, families, and refugees fleeing the conflict that had torn the country apart. Commandeered by forces loyal to Venustiano Carranza, the train was a testament to the desperation of the time. Passengers crowded every available space, inside the carriages, on the roofs, clinging to the sides. It was a human tapestry of survival, packed far beyond the train's safe capacity. The route from Colima to Guadalajara was treacherous, winding through mountains with steep gradients and sharp curves. The train's engineer faced an impossible task, controlling a massively overloaded machine through terrain that showed no mercy. Historical records suggest the train weighed nearly twice its recommended load, creating a perfect storm of mechanical failure. As the train approached the steep descent near the village of Temamatla, something went terribly wrong. The brakes, strained beyond their limits, began to fail. Eyewitness accounts describe a moment of mounting terror as the train's speed increased uncontrollably. At a sharp curve overlooking a deep ravine, physics made its brutal calculation. The derailment was catastrophic. Carriages shattered like glass, tumbling into the gorge below. The impact was so violent that many passengers died instantly, crushed, dismembered, or thrown from the train. Survivors would later describe a hellscape of twisted metal and human remains. The ravine transformed into a nightmare of destruction. The human cost was staggering. Between 600 and 800 people lost their lives in those few terrible moments. Bodies were so badly mangled that many remained unidentified. Local villagers and rescue workers were overwhelmed by the scale of the tragedy, struggling to recover remains and identify victims in the remote, rugged terrain. This was more than just a train accident. It was a stark illustration of the human cost of the Mexican Revolution, a moment that captured the fragility of life during one of Mexico's most tumultuous periods. The Guadalajara train disaster would become a haunting symbol of the war's brutal, indiscriminate nature. The Ciurea rail disaster. In the bitter winter of 1917, as World War I tore through Eastern Europe, a single train became a symbol of Romania's desperate struggle for survival. This was not just a journey, it was an escape, a last hope for hundreds of families fleeing the advancing armies of the Central Powers. The train departing for Lassi carried more than just passengers. It carried the raw essence of a nation under siege. Refugees, soldiers, children, entire families compressed into a metal vessel of hope and terror. Souls were crammed into carriages never designed to hold such human cargo, each person a living testament to the brutal urgency of war. As the train wound through the snow-covered landscapes of northeastern Romania, it was already a disaster waiting to happen. Outdated carriages groaned under impossible weight. Passengers sat shoulder to shoulder, some clinging to the roof and sides, their desperation greater than their fear. This was survival in its most. The approach to Ciurea railway station would become a moment of unimaginable horror. On a steep incline, the train's overtaxed braking system failed completely. What began as a controlled descent quickly transformed into an unstoppable descent into catastrophe. Witnesses would later describe the derailment as apocalyptic. Wooden carriages splintered like matchsticks. Those not killed instantly by the impact were trapped in a rapidly spreading inferno. The wooden cars, already dry and brittle, burned with a ferocity that consumed everything in its path. Survivors spoke of hellish scenes. Passengers trapped in burning carriages, desperate screams piercing the winter air. Local villagers and railway workers became improvised rescuers, using whatever tools they could find to pull survivors from the burning wreckage. But the scale of the disaster overwhelmed their efforts. In the chaos of war and destruction, many victims would remain unidentified, entire families erased in a single terrible moment. When the flames finally died, between 800 and 1,000 lives had been lost. It was a microcosm of the war itself, a tragedy born of desperation, infrastructure failure, and the brutal randomness of survival. The Ciurea rail disaster would become a footnote in the larger story of World War I, a single devastating moment that captured the human cost of a conflict that was reshaping the world. Decades later, it remains a haunting reminder of how quickly hope can transform into horror. So, what do you think about these disasters? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's unravel this together. Want more deep dives into history's most shocking moments? Subscribe for stories that will leave you stunned, horrified, and hungry to learn more. Join us next time as we unravel the extraordinary stories hidden in history's darkest corners.